Of course you recognise that face. Not all Australians can sing and dance or host the Tony Awards like Hugh Jackman. I can, but most Australians can't. You've seen that fantastic ESPN ad where everyone's expecting Michael Jordan, and this short white accountant comes out and they go, oh. I had that experience the other day in Boston that I'm talking in a shop trying to buy something. A woman turns around hearing my voice. Oh, yeah, she didn't get Hugh Jackman, she got the mathematician. So that is kind of a letdown for everyone. The other thing that you might know about Australians is that the Australian Football League is rather unique, that it also has a player draft. Now, this is the organising body for Australian rules football. As far as I know, outside of North America, there are only two professional sports that actually use a player draft. That's the AFL and a Russian hockey league called the Continental Hockey League, which is apparently quite large and has a similar system to what you're using here. So the AFL's had some problems with its draft. So this is an article from earlier this year. In 2009, the Melbourne Demons, Melbourne Football Club, basically had the extreme incentive that if they could only lose their last few matches, they would get both the first and second picks in the draft under what was called a priority pick system, because they'd virtually won no games for 2 years in a row. Now, this naturally created an incentive for them to lose. There's some evidence come out that, yes, that's what they tried to do, against the rules, of course, and the investigation just finalised last week, so these are the headlines. No tanks. Tanks for nothing. Basically, what the AFL recognised was that in creating this extreme incentive to not perform, that they had contributed to the problem. Now, they have suspended a couple of coaches. They've fined a team, I think, $500,000. But basically they said, well, the players that went out on the field, they tried to win the game. Yeah, they didn't send the best team out on the field, but that doesn't constitute tanking. We'll just give them a slap on the wrist. So that's what came out of that. And the AFL is certainly looking for solutions to draft-related issues like that in the future. Now let's go back 77 years. So Bert Bell would go on to become NFL commissioner, but at the time that he invented the draft, he was actually the owner of the Philadelphia Eagles. I don't know how he did it, but he managed to convince all the other team owners that they needed competitive parity, competitive balance in the league, and to introduce this brilliant revolutionary idea that you have a reverse order draft based on your position the previous season. Now, when you think about it, it's a great idea, but it's also straight out of the playground. You know, if you're familiar with, you get to pick in turn, and at the end all us geeks are standing there hoping we're not going to be the last one picked, but that's the way that it works, very similar to that. But when you think about it, there's some real flaws just from the start here. It doesn't matter whether if you're one rung lower than another team, you get a pick before them every round of the draft. Now, you might have had exactly the same record as them, you might have lost a hell of a lot more games, you might be not in the same class as that team, but there's that, the structure works the same way depending on exactly where you are on the standings rather than anything else that might come into it. There's actually no reason to think that the standard reverse order draft is optimal for competitive balance or for any other purpose, really. So fundamentally, the draft here is about players, and especially star players, the ones who bring obvious added value, like Bruce Smith here. In the language of quantum physics, which is what I studied in college, a champion player is what we would call grossly quantized. So he's high value and he is indivisible. So you can't just hire his services for half a season or a game. You have to get him, added to your roster. So if he's not available, you can't find anyone of the same quality to replace him, and you're obviously all familiar with this value over replacement player measure. His VORP, his VORP, is about the best you can get. And for the same reason, early draft picks are grossly quantized, because they give you the ability to draft someone like him, someone who's well above that replacement level. Now, why is quantization a problem? Well, in economic terms, it reduces labour mobility. If I want to trade for someone who's worth, I think, about the 15th pick in the draft, but I own the 1st and the 30th pick, how do I go about arranging that? And you've seen the ways that franchises do that. Trade future picks, bring other players into the equation, bring in a third one to make some sort of triangular deal. It's very uncomfortable. It's very much like bartering instead of trading. So the other problem with quantization is that it could give you that perverse incentive to underperform, which we've seen, and when you know that one extra loss can tip you into the next ability to get a much better player. So the draft lottery is a crude version of dequantization, which is what I'm talking about here, because it gives teams a fraction of a chance to win the top pick, but it can also lead to pretty arbitrary and unfair outcomes if a team that's in dire need doesn't get the help it needs through the draft, and it doesn't get compensated later in the draft either. The league can also use the draft to compensate franchises for free agency, for penalising them for offences of some sort in the draft, and those then get tied sometimes to their position in the standings as well, which can amplify that unfairness. They don't get the same penalty for the same crime in a way. So despite all these lotteries, multi-party tradings, a lot of other things over the years, there's still fundamental problems with the nature of the draft. But I claim that extreme value statistics can fix them, and we can dequantise this process right from the start. So in 1936, again, the same year that Bert Bell established the NFL draft, a German statistician named Emil Gumbel was in exile in France, having objected to Nazism. He was actually a prominent peace campaigner at that time. And he came up with his seminal paper in that time called The Extreme Values of Statistical Distributions. He was one of the pioneers of extreme value theory, which is the theory of statistics that happen that are the maximum values of a natural process over time. So the eponymous Gumbel distribution, that's the equation there. I think that's the only equation I've got here today. It accurately describes the tails of a huge number of natural processes, including all that are normal in some sense, so that follow a Gaussian distribution or a lot of other distributions that are similar to that. And in fact, Emil Gumbel spent his last 25 years just south of here in New York and made major contributions to the understanding of extreme weather events across America and flooding, that sort of thing. As far as I can tell, he didn't make any contribution to professional sport, so I'm hoping to change that. See, one of the applications of extremal statistics is to look at the fringes of the population, those people with some remarkable ability that 99.99% of their peers don't have. In the case of football or any other sport where you can measure talent, we can look at the catchment population and expect that the best performers will have an ability that sits along this curve, or a curve very similar to this. So every player that gets drafted basically has a standard, more than 3.25 standard deviations above the population as a whole. Now this has been, this is different because the size of the draft is obviously different. I've actually done this on the Australian Football League, but it's really only a few things that change when you go from league to league. You can also see here that the difference between the 30th and the 50th best member of the population is about 0.14 sigma standard deviations, which is less than the difference between the first and second, and that's a familiar concept to you that the truly outstanding athletes, the ones that are more than 4 standard deviations, are very rare indeed. So what you can also notice about this graph is that this is basically how XVT, extreme value theory, works. The area under the graph between successive points is roughly constant as you move across. That's how this system was set up originally. And I'll give you an example of that here. Okay, sorry, that one's not coming up. Sorry. Seems to be hanging.
Ah. Hang on, I'll use my MIT skills to get it going.
Just doesn't like that slide.
It doesn't at all.
Okay.
Okay, so let's take a minute here, and we will stop this presentation real quick. And see if we can get this to work. There we go. All right, well, we're stuck on Galton's
I'll skip
difference.
That one.
Okay.
So I'll go back to, I'll try and describe what's on this missing one, but if you do a comparison between the curve that you get from that extreme value theory and the draft charts that have been going around since the 80s and 90s, you get a terribly poor fit. But you get a very good fit if you have a look at some of the empirical research that's happened in the last few years, and maybe some of the people in this room have done some of that research, where you look at the length and the quality of players' careers that have been drafted at that position. So again, starting with 3,000 as the top player and moving down towards 0, you get quite a good match depending on your calibration from this formula. All right, so I'll go to Galton's difference problem. This is again ancient history, dates from 1902, but had never been applied to sport as far as I could tell, even though he was talking about sporting competitions, and he said that in a contest of skill like shooting, chess, something like that, if I only want to give prizes to my first two competitors and I've got $100,000 to give out, what's the most suitable way to distribute that between the two prize winners? Well, what does he mean by suitable? Where do we start to even answer that question? And so what he did was to talk about the merit, the expected merit of these competitors, very similar to an idea of talent, and to say the excess of expected merit of the second placed competitor and the excess of expected merit of the first place competitor would be in this ratio, and that ratio there gives a prize of $75,400 to the first place getter. So we can extend that in terms of talent of players in the draft to multiple prizes, multiple players, and assign them and get the curve that I should have been able to show you before. So if we accept this theoretical model of player talent, player value, what can we do with it except for marginally improve the draft charts that are going around at the moment? Well, we can totally overhaul the whole system of drafting. Instead of giving franchises a collection of draft picks, we give them a bucket of draft points. That allocation can more fairly reflect what each franchise needed or needs to get to a sort of par level with the league, or however you want to define that par level. You can put all sorts of things into that formula, the final standings position, the win-loss. You can take into account injuries, you can take into account multiple seasons, you get a much fairer assessment of what a franchise needs to get to whichever level you're deciding about, and that can change from league to league. The most important thing about the formula is that it's more continuous, so it doesn't have these quantum leaps as you lose another game and go below another team to give you a much better position in the draft. So the recruiting managers then, gone forward a bit. Recruiting managers then trade the draft points with each other to get specific players, but they don't have to negotiate a parcel of picks, they just have to strike a single fair value for each player. If that's about halfway between, say, the third and the fourth pick, they can do that. They can pick the number that reflects that value. So by using draft points as cash, trading's gone from this sort of grossly quantised bartering to just like, hiring someone on a salary or paying for something with cash. So on draft day, how do we turn these points back into picks? well, there's an algorithm that's really very simple. The team that has the most points wins the right to exercise the next pick, and they then have that pick value subtracted from their total. Then the team that has the most points left gets the next pick, and so on and so on. So the way that a draft can then look, if we look at the left-hand matrix here, that's your regular reverse order draft in a 16-team league. Now, after a redistribution of points, you might get something like the one on the right, where you get a bit of scatter in the second and third rounds, and it's almost looking random towards the end. And what this has done is, you can see at the start that the first team's actually got their second pick 12th, and they've got further picks quite high. The teams that miss out on an early pick just because they've got fewer points get compensated later so that their total points adds up to what they deserve. But you can see now we've got a marketing problem because we've lost lottery day. So, we don't have that edifying spectacle of all the GMs sitting in a room and waiting for the balls to drop. Well, we've got something better than that. Oh, sorry, I've jumped ahead a bit too much. This is what the 2013 NFL draft might look like under that system. We can see that if you make made some broad assumptions about what number of points these teams might get. So the Chiefs get the first pick. They then don't get their second pick till after the Jaguars. They mightn't even get it until after but they might get it before some teams have had any picks. So you can see the second order will be, the second round of the draft will be in quite a different order. So back to what I was saying before, auctioning the first 3 picks, or even the first 10 picks, or however many we need. The mathematical reason for why would we consider an auction is these are the Gumbel distributions for the first 3 picks, and you can see that the distributions are quite wide. So from year to year, the talent of the first few picks in particular is, it varies quite a lot. As you get further back along the distribution, those peaks get narrower and narrower. So there's more reason to think that the player that sits around about 100th would be in a particular spot worth a particular number of points. But certainly an auction would take into account the value of the real talent pool that's there that year. And what I'm thinking of in an auction system is not that the players would be paraded out and auctioned, but that the pick would be auctioned, and then the team that wins that pick says, right, with that pick, I'm taking this player. So you sort of get a drama, I guess, through that as well, which was talked about at a panel yesterday morning, that if they could find a way to do a draft auction, that there might be an audience for it. So that would be good. Now, if a weak team doesn't bid early on, doesn't get those early picks, it's naturally compensated through this system by having quite a collection of high-value picks, maybe in the teens or whatever, to add up to the number of points that they need. Well, thank you. I hope I've convinced you that there's still problems with professional league drafts and that extreme value theory might help to fix them. I've had a peer-reviewed paper published on this a couple of years ago, which is worth reading, even if you don't know much about AFL. But there's some calibrations that need to go on for each league to account for roster size and all that sort of thing. So, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Darren. We have time for some questions.
Okay.
Are there any questions?
Certain teams have different preferences as far as where they like to pick. A team like the Patriots comes to mind, where they like to sort of pile up on second-round picks. And if through the season they're accumulating all these draft points and don't necessarily want the top pick, is that something they'd have to just do after the fact, I guess, after the picks were allotted?
Yeah, essentially it would only be related to whether they want to bid for a certain pick and how many points they're allocated. They don't get any choice then as to how they get allocated those picks.
Could you just talk a little bit about how the salary cap rules in the NFL would affect people's choices in a system like this?
That's really outside of the realms of what I know. As far as I can tell, the way that players would get drafted is very similar to how it already works. It's just it'd be a different collection of players. So if there's a salary cap overlay on that, then it works the same way.
I'm just wondering how you think this would affect the distribution of what positions are usually picked. Usually they pick O tackles or QBs or traditionally the biggest number 1 overall picks. And do you think that this will change that to just the team need more specifically?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. My expertise, I guess, is in Australian rules football, where positions are somewhat interchangeable, and I think that would directly correspond to hockey in some sense, and to a lesser extent baseball. For basketball especially, and for football, there's going to have to be some localisation in terms of making sure that the population statistics that you're using are correct, and that if you're drafting by role, how does that affect this? I'm not really sure. That's research that needs to be done here. Yeah.
All right, Darren, we have time for one more question.
Okay.
Do you imagine that you could roll over points from year to year, or would that create issues of teams trying to stockpile to beat each other for a future number 1, or say that this is a weak draft now or later?
Yeah, good question about the practicality of that. As far as I can tell in the simulations I've done, the number of points that teams get left with is very few. If a team decides to bank points for the next year, maybe they can do that. That's really, for a commission to decide if it gets that far.
Let's give Darren a round of applause. Thank you, Darren.